I am very honored to introduce Tristan Harris and Frances Haugen. Tristan is a technology ethicist, the co-founder and CEO of the Center for Humane Technology, and a leading voice and just an incredible person to work on these issues, who brings so much energy, passion, and dedication to this. It is truly his life's purpose, and it is just inspiring to see you speak in different settings and be here with you in this council. And Frances Haugen, of course, a data scientist, an engineer, and worked at Google, Facebook, of course, Pinterest, I believe Yelp as well, and was leading efforts at Facebook to try to make things better, to try to use these platforms as something that could actually be positive in the world, and figure out let's mitigate and figure out ways to downgrade all these harms that are happening. And I'm gonna work my tail off to make this happen. Then, of course, she realized that the platforms were not being sincere, that there was a lot of really challenging, shady things happening inside, and they were not being honest with the people. And she decided to put the American public, and what was right ahead of her own career, and had the bravery to come forward and blow the whistle. And we are honored to have you on this council. We're honored to have you today. So with that, I'll like Tristan and Frances to please come up and.
Can you all hear us? Yes.
Can you hear us? Yeah.
You can see us. We can stand if you can't see us.
Yeah.
But
I was a little worried about the people in the back. Oh, is my mic on? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. Oh, wonderful. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. For those who don't know me, I'm Tristan Harris. And how many people here have seen The Social Dilemma? Okay, so most of you know. Okay. So I was a design ethicist at Google, and I also was part of a lab, excuse me, I took a class at Stanford called the Persuasive Technology Behavior Design class as part of the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab with many of the founders of the Instagrams and the Snapchats and many of the early employees at Facebook and so on. Later became a design ethicist at Google, concerned about how do you ethically shape and transform the identity, values, beliefs, attention, behavior of 3 billion people who are jacked into this attention economy every single day. And Frances, would you like to introduce yourself now?
As I was introduced, I'm a data scientist and an algorithmic product manager. So I design kind of ephemeral experiences. So things like search quality on Google or recommendation quality on Pinterest's home feed. And I ended up working on civic misinformation at Facebook. So misinformation in places where there was not third-party fact checking. So many of the most vulnerable places in the world.
So Frances, let's start with you. So I think people underestimate the amount of risk that you took on to come out. You have $1 trillion company who...
It was a $1 trillion company.
What's that?
It was a $1 trillion company.
Yes. I mean, you risked your life going to prison, having a $1 trillion company throw bazillions of dollars in legal fees at you. Could you say why you were willing to take that risk?
So I'm a Midwesterner, just like Dick, and I am not prone to exaggeration, but I want you to take that weight when I say the next thing. So I was working on how was Facebook influencing the information environment, some of the most vulnerable places in the world. Most people are not aware that Facebook went into countries around Africa, around South America, around Southeast Asia, and said, if you use our products, the internet is free, your data is free. If you use anything on the open web, you're going to pay for it yourself. And Facebook became the internet for at least 1 billion or 1.5 billion people. People who live in countries that make up 3 or 4 billion people. And then they didn't give any of the security services, or gave very, very minimal of the security services they gave to us in the United States. That we think the version of Facebook that we use, of Instagram that we use, is the safest, cleanest version of Facebook in the world. And I genuinely fear that there are tens of millions of lives on the line in places like African countries and Southeast Asia. We've seen 2 genocides so far, Myanmar and Ethiopia. And I think those are opening chapters of a dystopian novel that I desperately don't want to read the end of.
So why is it that you think, in talking to you, I know that you were, while on that team, you would be looking with the civic integrity team at posts, the most popular posts, like the 10 most popular posts in Ethiopia, and seeing it was beheading videos, it was things like that, just give people a taste of the kinds of things that you were seeing. Because I think you open up a Facebook feed here, you say, okay, occasionally I see some political content. I see some weird divisive conspiracy theory going viral. But what were you seeing, in those countries?
So Facebook had a team that was called the Social Cohesion Team, which was the team that was responsible for fighting ethnic violence. And we had a thing called Virality Review every week or every other week, where they bring in translators and explain to us the most popular 10 posts in each country that were at risk, our tier 1 at-risk countries. And every single post would be a beheading video. It'd be an accusation that the opposition was molesting children, that this child was kidnapped and tortured, like truly horrific misinformation. So there's this question of why was this the most popular content in those countries when we don't see that here? And that's because Facebook was spending 87% of its operational budget for misinformation on English, even though only 9% of users spoke English. And I want to remind you, the United States is not a country of only English speakers. It is a country of many, many Spanish speakers, many, many other languages. And they are not going to use as safe a version of Facebook as English speakers can.
And so
they wanted us not to ask questions. And they wanted us not to demand more. And that's why they hid the reality from us.
one of the things that's so interesting about the perception of you publicly is that you're known as the Midwesterner that cares about the kids. And what you and I first started talking about when we got to know each other was actually these global harms, breakdowns of democracy and ethnic violence, but you're known for the teen mental health harms. What do you think is the reason why that's true?
They're interconnected. So the reason why we see the most viral content in those countries being these horrific pieces of content is that the algorithms push us towards extremism. That when you have algorithms that say content is better if it gets more clicks, it ignores the fact that the shortest path to a click is hate, anger, division. And when it comes to kids, you can start with a blank Instagram account, no friends, no interests, and just do some very innocuous searches like healthy eating, healthy recipes. And just by clicking on the first 5 pieces of content each day, within a couple of weeks being taken to pro anorexia content. If you're mildly depressed, it can push you towards self-harm content. These algorithms escalate. It's an escalator that goes up ever more.
And so in other words, as you said, the harms are interconnected. So what seems like we have one set of harms for teen mental health happening over here. So we should bite that off and chew it. Let's solve that problem. But then we have this other set of harms called ethnic violence or breakdown of democracy or conspiracy theories. Let's bite that problem off and chew it. But what you're saying is they're not disconnected problems. They're interconnected. And so I think what we should do now is just quickly talk about what are the drivers for how all these problems are going on. So just to say a little bit of our perspective, starting in 2013, when I was studying the attention economy at Google, it was pretty clear that there were these key drivers that were going to drive the world culturally in specific directions. Because if you have a certain set of base facts, okay, we have a private company worth $1 trillion whose business model is they have to get more attention every year. And these companies all together have an ego.
Because their business model is ads. So the more attention you give, the more ads they give.
And each of these companies has an ego or an embedded growth obligation. They have to grow every year and every quarter. With that ego also comes, it's growing what? Do they grow just data that they collect? Well, yes, but they also have to grow the amount of attention that they get from humanity. And if I don't get that attention, the other one will. And so if Instagram doesn't add a beautification filter to match TikTok in the arms race for teenagers' mental health, Instagram's just going to lose the arms race. And so it's pretty simple game theory. But when you then say, okay, if I don't do the 3-second videos versus the 30-second videos, I'm going to lose to the guy that does the 3-second videos. So when you play that out, this race for attention, starting in 2013, the reason that I came out, my version of Francis's story, is that we can predict the future. I can tell you exactly what society is going to look like if you let this race continue. I have in my hands actually a gift from the Nantucket Project. This is a little elephant. And the reason they gave me this little gift is because all these problems are part of the same elephant. Weakening of the US on the national security stage, population-centric information warfare, weakening teenage mental health, shortening attention spans, beautification filters, unrealistic standards of beauty for teenagers, more polarizing extreme content, more conspiracy theories. These are all predictable phrases that describe a future that if you allow this to continue, I can tell you exactly what the world's going to look like. And part of the reason we're all here today is to not just talk about those problems, we want to solve them, because we know that this leads to a total dystopian catastrophe novel that unfortunately is playing out true every day.
And I want to unpack that a little bit. Like we've heard people say things like they're intentionally designing these systems for anger. They're intentionally designing them for division. One of the things that I was really struck by when I went to Facebook was how kind and conscientious the people were that work there. You know, the kind of people who work at social media companies are people who value connection, right? You know, they're not, shadowy figures. But what Tristan's talking about here about the market incentives, the fact that these are private companies that we are asking to run critical public infrastructure in a completely untransparent way. We're asking them to maintain public safety, to maintain national security when those are cost centers, they're not profit centers. And so you end up in a situation where they may want to do better, but because they have to meet these market incentives each year, it's hard for them to get there. So I guess the question I have for you, Tristan, is like, what conversation should we be having then?
So in preparation for answering that question, I think one thing we have to notice is that per the E.O. Wilson quote that we always go back to, that the fundamental problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions and brains, medieval institutions, and accelerating godlike technology. And I repeat it thousands and thousands of times because of how true it is and how deep it is as an insight to then see how do we solve the problem. And part of the medieval institutions is that law always lags the new tech. We don't need a new conception of privacy until you have ubiquitous cameras that start getting rolled out, in the 1900s. We don't need a right to be forgotten until new 21st century technology can remember you forever. So one of the problems is that we have technology moving so fast, and the current regulatory environment is, okay, well, I have these existing moral philosophies of privacy and data protection, and these are good. We want these things. But notice that the breakdown of teenage mental health or extremism in Ethiopia, or this arms race for attention and engagement, it's an adjacent and slightly different set of areas, and we don't have laws or moral conceptions for those areas.
And so often when we write laws, we write them about externalities, right? That when we have the system operating in isolation, there are incentives where these
What is an externality?
So an externality is when there's a cost. So let's say Facebook's going ahead, they're getting you to pay attention, they're getting you to click on ads, they get money for those ads. They're offloading onto you, though, the anxiety that's building in your heart, the child that took their own life, the political division at Thanksgiving.
Those don't show up on the balance sheet
Yeah.
of Facebook. They don't have to deal with the Thanksgiving conversations that don't work anymore.
And the thing we want to emphasize is that there are really good, really simple, practical solutions that would reduce a lot of these problems. It's things like that escalator where you keep going for more and more extreme content. When we talk to pediatricians, when we talk to child psychologists, they say, kids get that this is happening. They get that when they go in there, they feel more anxious. They get that it's making their eating disorder worse. But they're being forced to choose between their past and their future, right? They can give up their account. They can get a new algorithm. They can reset the algorithm, but they have to give up all their friends and connections. They have to give up all their past memories. And kids aren't willing to give up their past for their future. They should be allowed to reset the model anytime they want to. Any of you should be allowed to reset your model. You should have that right, even if it's going to make Facebook less money. It's things like saying, how do you put mindfulness in the sharing process? Do you require people to click a link before you share it? Or things as simple as, what level of hypervirality do we want to endorse? When something gets beyond friends of friends, imagine a world where instead of having a little reshare button where you can keep spreading the misinformation, we said, we value choice. We value intentionality. You can say whatever you want, but once it gets beyond friend of friends, you have to copy and paste if you want to spread it further. That change sounds pedantic. You're like, Francis, why are you asking me about colors on share boxes or share fingers? The reality is that simple change has the same impact on misinformation as the entire third-party fact-checking program. Only no individual is now saying this is a good idea or a bad idea. Design choices matter.
So let's actually break that down, because this is a profound statement that we were both, you said it first, it came out of Francis's disclosures to the Wall Street Journal, that in Facebook's own research, simply taking away the share button and having you say, I can still copy and paste the text manually and share it again, but adding that one piece of friction in where I have to share manually.
I have to intentionally do it.
I have to intentionally do it.
Not mindlessly.
We're talking about a tiny change. something that a JavaScript engineer can spend a day and it's done. And that would be more effective than, I think you said in the documents, $1 billion spent on content moderation and all the other sort of trust and safety
I don't know
initiatives.
about all that, but the third-party fact-checking program where they pay journalists to go out there and write articles and say this link, this concept is no longer allowed on our platform. That program.
So I think then that this gets to the point then. So why wouldn't a trivial change that an engineer could make in one day, why isn't that happening?
So this comes back to this question around externalities and incentives. The reason why we have to push for things like platform transparency, right? So the PATA Act, Platform of Transparency and Accountability Act, it would allow us to see inside those companies. You know, what would it look like in terms of what people would be willing to stand up and demand if they could see for themselves that data instead of just taking my word for it or looking at the documents that I brought out? We have to have the ability to have those countervailing incentives, because otherwise the profit motive will just keep pushing away from these really simple, sensible changes.
So one of the things that I find so ironic is when Frances came out, I actually was in a gym in New York watching from a hotel room, and I was like on the elliptical and I was working out, and I was watching live her give the Senate testimony hearing. And I started crying because I was so moved by the fact that she had done something in 9 years that I had never seen happen, which was she got bipartisan consensus. And you had senators from the left and the right saying, we don't disagree. I think it was 5 or 6 times they said, we don't disagree. We're going to solve this problem. And then the next day, stories went viral on Facebook and Twitter saying that Frances was some kind of operative, or that she was actually a plant by the government to justify
More censorship.
Or that Facebook planted, it was like more and more bizarre stuff. And she had a meeting next day with one of the major senators who the day before had agreed and said, we got to do something about this. And this is I won't say the name, but this is someone who like doesn't typically agree on these issues. And the senator canceled the meeting because this meme had started to spread on social media. And the great irony, and I've had to repeat this in every interview since then, one of the core parts of my testimony was the idea that when we focus on content moderation, solving these problems after the fact, it doesn't just distract us from real solutions. It leaves behind everyone who doesn't speak one of the 20 biggest languages in the world. And that's what causes that ethnic violence that I talked about in the beginning. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this story up is that when people sow distrust about your motivations as a person, then they don't trust. I was a crisis actor. The solution. Yeah, you're a crisis actor. Yeah. And I think that the point is that our society runs on trust, and Facebook and Twitter are trust degrading machines because they reward those who are more and more innovative and coming up with new species of cynicism and distrust. The better you are at adding inflammation to a cultural fault line, at adding cynicism to a motivation of an institution, you will be paid 100x more likes, followers, rewards, and reach than if you do not do that. And when you set in a society up like that, I think one of the things that's actually hopeful about that is we've been living in this 24/7, I was a magician as a kid, we've been living in this 24/7 magic trick that everyone's cynical about everything, when really there's a handful of people who are cynical and we gave them 100x reach. And so there actually are trivial solutions like the things that Frances talked about. She just mentioned one. And I know today we're going to get into many, many, many solutions. There's 100 things that we could do, and we could do them tomorrow. And we'd agree on them. And we agree on them. And the disagreement is an illusion. It's a magic trick. So I want to, I think we're running out of time. So we're going to hit on just one or two more quick things. First, national security. So one of the big themes for this council is on national security. And people need to understand what we're facing now is a national security problem. Big tech looks invincible. They look huge. They look monolithic. $1 trillion company. $1 trillion company should be able to do anything, right? Even Twitter. Twitter is a multi-billion-dollar company, $50 billion. We had a major whistleblower come out in the last couple of months. So Peter Zatko, I always mispronounce his name, Mudge. He came out and he said, Twitter is running on duct tape and gum, right? Shoestring. Their data centers are running hundreds of thousands of computers on out-of-date software because they can't staff the people to update them. They're running on such industry, not even industry best practices, that if you took out 1 or 2 data centers at certain times, all of Twitter could have been lost permanently. And to me, when I saw this testimony, a giant red light went off for me. Because the thing that we don't understand is that right now, like we're going to Mars with SpaceX.
because there is a pipeline, a supply chain of aeronautical engineers with PhDs. Every security professional that worked at Twitter learned it on the job. They learned it at Twitter. They learned it at Facebook and went to Twitter. They learned it at a handful of other companies. And Twitter is not profitable or sexy enough to get enough really basic security people. We have a huge supply chain problem and it is endangering our national security.
One of the things you told me, and then I want to switch to optimism, is what was it? I just lost my train of thought. When you were working at Facebook, you left, I think, after the 2020 election. And you said up until that point, we had these teams that were staffing election integrity, election safety. And then you said after the election, everyone was so burnt out. It was like we lost the senior neurotechnicians for the brain implant, and now we got the junior varsity team who's left to try to keep handling our systems. So in the junior varsity team, and because of this talent issue you're talking about,
Yeah.
people also get burnt out. They're aware of the problems that we're talking about. And so there's this kind of moral internal issue where it's very hard to actually get people who can solve these problems, especially through the growing success of this kind of movement that's revealing that there's a problem. And so we do need to have more moral courage and more people working at these companies. That's why Francis said at the beginning, I want more talented people working at Facebook, not less, as a result of me coming out.
We have military academies because we understand that national security is so complicated and nuanced that we have to train leaders who understand the complexity of how to keep the nation safe. One of the reasons why the disclosures are so large, it's 22,000 pages. Like I literally wore a back brace at points because hunched over my computer to take these photos, it was that hard. The reason I brought them out was that top tier, the only reason why they were able to ask the questions they asked, to have the intuition they had, was because a lot of these people were veterans that had been at Facebook for 7, 8 years. And they were all retiring. They dissolved civic integrity, and something like 2/3 of our team just left the company. And a lot of those people didn't go into security in other companies. They went into other things because they couldn't do it anymore. So we have 5 minutes left.
With 5 minutes
Okay,
left,
good,
I
good,
know that
good.
you're an
Yeah.
incredibly optimistic person, and I just wanted to give you a space to talk
No,
about
I think you should do your transition thing, like transition.
what
You have 3 steps to change things.
we're letting you into the fourth.
Yeah, yeah,
What is it? Breaking
yeah,
the
yeah.
fourth wall.
Breaking the fourth wall. You have your framing of 3 timelines.
3 times.
I really like your
yes.
timelines. Okay.
Okay.
I really like this concept. So I want him to talk about it.
Well, so I think it's important because it's
Triage, transition.
Yeah.
Good, good.
so there are 3 timelines for solutions, and I mention this because it's important because I think these problems can feel very overwhelming. They're massive.
We need scaffolding to
And
fix
so we
it.
need a scaffolding model of our minds, like how are we going to build up towards those solutions? There's triage solutions, which are things that existing companies can do today, sometimes in the span of a day, an hour, or a week or a month, that when, for example, Apple makes changes to the privacy features, that can take $10 billion a year off of Facebook's revenue and the entire surveillance capitalism kind of model by Apple kind of being a short-term regulator and interim solution.
There's solutions on teen mental health where we could turn them on in the next 2 weeks and you probably cut the suicide rate the next year by 25%. Like that sounds ridiculous, but I could put a whiteboard up here and just lay it out for you.
Yeah. So there's triage solutions, and we should do all those, and we should make lists of them. And frankly, we shouldn't have just a handful of people in this room. We should have a collective intelligence, almost like an incentive prize. We want as many people in the world saying, within the boundaries of the current incentive model, what are the immediate things that would make the biggest difference that for the sake of getting more good faith returns from the public, what can these companies do? Then there's transition, which is how do we actually set the turns in motion to catalyze a shift in the incentives and the structure, things like passing the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act. Having just like we have cybersecurity requirements now growing on companies, can we have different kind of requirements, on national security from government? And then we also have long-term solutions, which is that in the long-term category, I think what we need to do is get from a thinking model that's how do we get to less toxic social media to instead tech plus democracy equals stronger democracy. Because right now, China is employing, and the CCP is employing the full suite of exponential technologies to make a new form of 21st century authoritarianism by employing the full suite of tech. And I don't think, when we look at democracies, we're not employing the full suite of 21st century technologies to make new and upgraded forms of democracy. We're instead allowing private business models to profit from the degradation of democracies. So the long term has to be, what is a vision for a digital democratic future?
And to end on an optimistic note, because I talk about things like ethnic violence a lot, and I've noticed it can be a downer. So to end on an optimistic note, because we can't change if we don't have hope, I want to remind everyone, our democracy has gone through crisis before. I have only had the right to vote as a woman for about 100 years. Contemplate that. That's insane. African Americans basically didn't have the right to vote in large parts of this country as recently as the 60s, or even more recently. We have had crisis before. And the thing about democracy is it is resilient. That democracy is a tree that grows because we tend to it, but it can heal, it can grow back. When it comes to new forms of media, every single time before when we've invented a new form of media, it has been incredibly disruptive. It might get substantially worse before it gets better. But every single time before, we have figured out how to respond. You know, when we invented the cheap printing press, newspapers, we literally had wars over misinformation. But we invented journalism schools and journalistic ethics and transparency rules over like who owns what and how much concentration can you have. When we invented the telegraph, this sounds crazy. The telegraph did not cause the Civil War, but historians believe it influenced when the Civil War was, because suddenly people could see that they disagreed with Washington, that they disagreed with Maine, they disagreed with, Minnesota. Suddenly we had one nation and we had to work through those problems together. Radio gave us personal relationships with our leaders, and it led to a lot of the movements that caused World War II. This has happened over and over and over again. And the reason why it feels overwhelming right now, why it feels like we don't know how to get out of it, is because this is our time to shine, right? This is our moment to stand up and do something. And we are going to figure out how to get out of this, but it takes work and we have to do it now. But I have faith that we're going to make it through this. So thank you.